Last video, we discussed automatic reference counting, some general memory stuff, and we added the weak self to our network call here. In this video, we're going to start populating our cells with the actual avatars. So on each cell, we're going to download the avatar image. We're going to get that up and running first, and then we're going to talk about caching the images, right? Because every time you're scrolling up and down the screen, if you don't cache it, it's going to download those every time a new cell comes on the screen. And that's just not very efficient. Whereas if we use a cache, we can download the image, put it in the cache, and then, if we need that image again, we pull it from the cache rather than making another network call. So we're going to talk about all that in this video. So head over to your GF avatar image view. And remember I said we were going to do more here. So let's create a function called func download image and then from, and then it's going to be a URL string. And so it's going to take in a string. And we're actually going to do our network call here. We're going to have a discussion on why I chose to do it here and not in our network manager. We'll talk about that after I get everything built and up and running, and then we'll have that discussion on why I chose this instead of that. So if you're wondering why are we doing this here, we'll talk about that in a bit. So for our network call, the first thing we need to do is get a URL from this URL string. So guard let URL equals URL, initialize the URL from a string, not file path URL, from a string. And that string is the URL string that we are passing in, and then else return. Now, you're going to notice something. We're not going to handle all the errors, and this kind of contributes into why I'm doing it here. Again, we'll have that discussion in a bit. Normally, if you remember in our network manager, let's go to managers, network manager. Here where I'm checking for the URL in just a normal network call, you see that I want to show the user an error, like, hey, this URL was not valid, and we want to let the user know. However, in our avatar image view, we're intentionally not handling errors. And the reason being is we're using our placeholder image as the error, essentially. It conveys the same message. And let's talk about that for a second. So if the user sees placeholder images, we're using that to convey hey, something went wrong downloading the images. Of course, you could pop up an error and say avatar image not available, but doesn't that say the same thing as just showing the placeholder image? At least that's my take on it, my opinion. And the other thing is, remember, this download image is getting called every time the GF avatar image view shows up, which is every time a new cell comes on screen. So popping up our collection view here, as you scroll up and down, if you're not familiar with how cell for item at index path works, every time a new cell comes on the screen, cell for item at index path gets called. So that means this is going to be called all the time. So if you can imagine, if we were popping up an error every time, something went wrong, there's 12 cells on the screen at once. You'd be popping up so many errors. It'd be just not good. So for that reason, and you're going to see throughout the rest of this network call, is we're intentionally not handling the errors. Because again, we're using our placeholder image to convey, hey, something went wrong getting the avatar, it's not working, rather than bombarding the user with errors. We're using that to convey that message. So now let's continue on with our network call. Let task equal URL session dot shared data task with URL, get the completion handler though. So this is the same exact code as you see here in the network manager, right? This basically we're repeating this, except we're not going to handle all these errors individually. And again, this is contributing to the reasoning, which we'll talk about, why I am doing this here and not in the network manager. So again, we'll get to that. So we want to pass in the URL that we had here on line 35. And again, hit return here to get this, name it data, response, error, and I like to get rid of my parentheses. I know I'm probably not consistent in this and before. Also, real quick, one of the last videos in the course, we're going to go through and do what I call proofreading. I do this with all my take-home projects. Literally going to go file by file and line by line and clean up stuff like this. Or if maybe we have a comment left over, it's kind of like back in school. If you were turning in a book report, right, and it was a really big project at the end of the semester or something like that, you would go over that book report with a fine-tooth comb to make sure everything was good. We're going to do that with this project as well, to do a lot of cleanup. And I highly recommend you do that with your take-home projects as well. Make sure it's clean, make sure everything's on point before you turn it in. As somebody who's received a lot of take-home projects during our hiring process, you'd be amazed at some of these sloppy code bases people actually turned in. I mean, there's just commented stuff out everywhere. Things aren't lined up nicely. It happens. Don't be that person. So now continuing with our network call, again, back to our network manager, we're repeating this stuff. We would need to handle the error, the response, and the data when they come back nil, except we're not going to handle the error, right? We're not going to pop up an error or show anything. We're just going to return. So it's going to look a lot neater and condensed here. If error not equal to nil, so that means if the error is something, we're just going to go ahead and return. We're done. Again, we're intentionally not handling the errors because the placeholder is our error message. Guard let response equal response as HTTP URL response, and then comma response dot status code. Again, this is the same code equals 200. We're making sure we got the 200 response. Again, this is the same exact stuff we've already done in the network manager, again, as you see here, but we're just not handling all the errors. So again, back to the image view. Now we need to do guard let data equal data, else return. And again, what we're doing here is making sure we actually have data. And then now we're going to actually, we've done all these checks. We have our data. Now we're going to create our image from the data and move on. So I forgot the else here. And then I'm going to get rid of this error here. It says immutable value task was never used. Remember, like I said, you may forget to do this. So down here, we want to call task.resume. Remember, that's what kicks off the network call. So now let's actually handle our data now that we have it. So like I said, we have our data. So let's do guard let image equals UI image. And we're initializing this, UI image. We're initializing this from data. You see it has an initializer where you can pass in data. So the data we're going to pass in is the data we've checked to make sure we have. So copy and paste that in there. And then, so this returns an optional. So that's why we are guard letting it. So again, else. And then just like before, we're returning. So like I said, if anything goes wrong with this network call, we're just getting out of here, not doing anything else, and just showing our placeholder. Like I said, the placeholder conveys the error message. So now that we have our image, we have to just set the avatar image view's image to this image. But now we're on a background thread, so we need to update this on the main thread because now we're actually updating UI. Just a real quick, I'm sure this should be basic knowledge, but in case you don't know, anytime you update your UI, you have to do it on the main thread. So dispatch queue.main.async to get on the main thread, self.image equals image, which we just had up here. Now you see we use self here in the closure, so we're going to have to do what we just talked about last time, weak self. And then since we're doing that, we're going to get a bunch of errors here, right? Because it's going to say self is optional. Well, we got one down there. But just like we did before, remember the guard let self equal self, else return. So again, we're just bouncing out at any bad sign. We're just bouncing out of here. And then now in our followers cell, let's go to our cells here, follower cell. Now down here, we can call, when we're setting the cell, again in the data source, we can call avatar image view dot download image from string. And the string we want to pass in is the follower dot avatar URL, right? That's on our model. So let's run through what's actually going to happen here. In our follower list VC, you see when we're configuring the data source, we're getting this cell. Every time this is configured, we're configuring the cell here with this cell.setFollower. This is how we configure each cell that comes on the screen. And so this goes into our follower cell, which will set the username text to login. Remember, this was already working. We've already tested this. But now we just added the avatar image view dot download image from the followers.avatar URL. So that's going to kick into the avatar image view. It's going to run all this. And again, it's going to do all this error checking, but we're not returning an error because we're going to show the placeholder, which we have up here. And if everything goes smoothly, we get an image, then we're going to switch to the main thread and show that image on the cell, and we're going to run the network call. So in theory, when we run this, we should see our avatar images populating in our collection view. Now we're not done. This is just the first step. Remember I talked about let's get it working and then we clean up, because like I mentioned before, we got to worry about the cache to really optimize this. We're going to make sure this is working first before we handle the cache. So SALEN 0400 get followers. And you see all of our avatars are pulling in. And as we scroll down, that download image is getting called as these new cells come on the screen. And like I mentioned, it's fine the first time you do it. Like you have to download them from somewhere. But now as we scroll back up, that download image is getting called again on the images we've already downloaded. So that's the kind of the inefficiency. Whereas we're going to create this cache in order to, once we download an image, shove it in the cache, and then we'll do a check like, hey, is this image in the cache? Cool, use that image. If it's not in the cache, download it. So we're gonna implement that cache, and then we're gonna talk about more about what a cache is. So let's do it. So stopping this, let's go to our network manager. Up here, we want to create our cache here, and I'll tell you why. Because we only want like one instance of the cache, and this network manager is the singleton. So this network manager will have the one instance of the cache. Like if we were to create our cache here in our avatar image view, we would have, you know, however many cells, like, because every time a new cell comes on the screen, we'd have a new GF avatar image view. So we'd have a bunch of different instances of caches, not the most efficient. So we're going to go to the network manager here, say let cache equal ns cache. And now, so if you've been around Swift for a while, probably not if you're still trying to get your first job. Back in like Swift 1, like we had a lot of like NS stuff, like NS string, NS array, and that's because we were still working on the transition from like the old Objective-C stuff, you know, into Swift. Since then, Swift has gotten its own stuff, so you don't see NS as much anymore. Fun fact, NS stands for Next Step, which was Steve Jobs' old company back in the 80s after he got fired from Apple the first time. He created that, and then Apple ended up acquiring that company. So anytime you see NS, that's a remnants from Next Step, like that company that got acquired into Apple. So I don't know, little fun fact. So NS cache, and this takes in a kind of like a key value pair, very similar to a dictionary. So the key is going to be of type NS string, and we have to use NS string and not string, again, because this is the NS cache. Again, Swift is slowly getting rid of all this NS stuff, but this is one of the few that are remaining. And so that's the key, and then the value is going to be a UI image. And we don't know about UI yet because we need UIKit instead of Foundation. So bring in UIKit to the network manager and initialize this cache. So now in our network manager, we have a cache. So how we're going to access this singular cache, right? We don't want a bunch of different caches. This singular cache, we're going to access by doing network manager.shared.cache. That's how we get that. And while we're here, because we don't want to do network manager.shared.base URL, most likely, let's make this private. That way, the only one we can access here is cache. So back down to the GF avatar image view. So we have our cache. So now, like I said, we want to check the cache first before we download this stuff in the download image. But first, let's actually create a variable for our cache, so we're not like just shorthand stuff. Let cache equal, you know, we got to line these up. Equals network manager.shared.cache. And we do that, so now that when we use cache down here, we don't have to type out network manager.shared.cache every time. So just kind of shorthanding it. So now that we have our cache there, let's do the check for it. And we want this to be like the very first thing we do. We'll clean this up in a bit. So if let image equals cache dot object, you see for key, and the key we need to pass in a string. So we're going to make our string the URL string. You basically need a unique string. And of course, every URL that is attached to that image we're going to download is going to be the unique key there. So URL string, that's how we're going to identify each object in the cache. And as you can see here, cannot convert value of type string to expected argument of NS string. So what it's saying, like I mentioned back here in the network call, is that, you know, this is still NS cache, so it needs to take in an NS string. We tried to give it a string, which is a Swift string. So it's saying, I can't do that. So we need to convert this to the to an NS string. So create a variable here, let cache key equals NS string, and then we're going to initialize an NS string from a Swift string. It's kind of just a way to convert it here. And the string is going to be URL string, and then now we're going to look up the cache key. So that's how we're going to look that up. And then, so if we have that image down here in the if let block, we want to do self, or just image. I don't think we have to do self, equals, yeah, we do have to do self because we needed image. Self.image, so we get the blue image, equals image. And then basically once we have our image, we need to return out of here. Like return, we're done, because we don't want to run any of the network calls if we have the cached image. If we don't have the cached image, we're going to proceed through the rest of the function, and it's going to basically, you know, download the image. So now that we're running this initial check to yank it from the cache, we need to actually set it to the cache like once we've downloaded it. So as you can imagine, right, then we go through, we download the image, check all the errors, hey, we get the image, and now we're setting the image to the actual image on the UI image view on the main thread. Here we can set that image into the cache, and we do that pretty simply by doing cache.set object. So this is very similar, if you've used like user defaults, which we're going to use in the future, very similar to that. So we're going to set the object. You can see we're going to set the image for a key. And as you can imagine, we already have that, right? We have the image here on line 52. Cool. Just use that image. And then we have the key up here with the cache key, because we're setting that no matter what. So cache key, which again will be the URL that we have. So let's space this out so we can see this here. And again, I like to put this on one line. So like I said, running through this here, this is all of our like basic error checking. Oops, we need to do self. My bad. Self.cache, because we're accessing that. So again, to run through this function real quick, we're doing the network call, handling all the errors. That's basically what this little chunk is. And we're not even handling the errors. We're just making sure we return out of the function so we don't try to download the image if there is an error. So we're making sure we return out. And again, our placeholder conveys the error message. If we have good data and we get the image, cool. Now we will set that image into the cache like that we have it. Remember, because ideally we're only downloading the image once, right? Because once it's downloaded, it's in the cache. And then once it's in the cache, we're never getting past this line of code or this chunk of code right here. So this, in theory, this should only be called once. So we're setting that into the cache, and then dispatch queue.main.async, going out to the main thread and setting our image to the image that we downloaded. And then again, if the image is already in the cache, just setting the image to that image and we're bouncing out. So let's run this to make sure it's still working, make sure I didn't break anything. And then we'll talk about more about why I put this network call here. So SALN0400, I guess casing doesn't really matter. And here we go. Everything working fine. We got all of our image, and we should be able to swipe up super fast because we're pulling from the cache and not like downloading, right? We should never be able to like, have the loadings thing. So back to our code. Let's talk about, again, the kind of the reasoning on why this is here. Because let me back up. Like I was torn on this. I refactored this out into the network manager. I did the result type and returned the image and then didn't really return an error. It was just, I didn't like that. Like I tried it, right? Because like you, my initial thought was like, hey, we're doing some networking. Got to go in the network manager. That's the initial thought. But I tried that. I did it. And the reason why it was a little weird is because we're not handling the errors, right? The benefits of having this network manager here, one of the benefit, there's many, but is like, look, you go through all the different error types and you are parsing like what error it is, right? Unable to complete, invalid response. So having all this elsewhere, like all this parsing and determining what error to show, and then you just pass it neatly back through the result type, like we saw here in our network call, right? You just pass it neatly back to the result type and you handle the success and the failure, and then you present the error that was parsed in the network manager, right? That's very valuable. That's awesome. This is super, super clean. However, for this, we don't need that value of parsing the error and handling all that. So I decided to put this here. And again, there's like I said, this is very down the middle. Like I could have gone either way. This is one of those decisions where you have to balance the trade-offs, and you may decide one way, I may decide the other way. Again, back to the whole like art of programming. I don't think there's one right answer. And let's actually back up a little bit to that word trade-off, because that's really every decision in programming has trade-offs, right? Almost nothing is like absolute perfect, the best decision. As a programmer, a key skill set you're going to develop is knowing the pros and cons of the many different choices you're going to have to choose between, and knowing the trade-offs of each, and then making what you think is the best decision given the trade-offs. And again, so in this case, in my mind, my opinion, the trade-offs are, yes, the bad thing is, yes, I am losing a little bit of organization by not having all my network stuff in my network manager. I get that. I understand that. However, I feel the benefits of having this here and not having unnecessary code in the network manager, right? Because when you do the result type, you have to pass in the error. Well, we're not handling the errors. We don't really care what the error is, but I still have to pass that in. So I'm going to have like a lot of this code that's like really unnecessary. That's what it really boils down to in my mind. Like it was unnecessary code that I felt was just much simpler to put here for the network call. And again, I understood the trade-offs. I know my organization like isn't going to be perfect. I know this one network call is in the avatar image view, not in the network manager. I understood that. I still felt it was more straightforward for the code base to be here. And I do want to reiterate, like this wasn't a slam dunk decision. I went back and forth on it like 3 or 4 times. I refactored it into the network manager, did the result type, and I was like, I just don't like that. So it was a tough decision. So if you disagree with this, like perfectly fine. I disagreed with myself 3 or 4 times before I landed on this. So, but I wanted to spend some time here discussing that because this is a good example of a lot of times programming decisions like this, like they're not cut and dry. Like, you know, there's trade-offs and you have to decide which way you want to go. And like I said before, you could probably ask 5 different programmers this same question. You might get, you know, they'll probably be split down the middle. So if you disagree with what I did, perfectly fine. You do some homework, refactor it out into the network manager and make this code base your own. But that is why I chose to do that. And I think that is the key lesson here. Like the actual decision that was made is not the important lesson. The important lesson is to be able to articulate that you understand the trade-offs. Like I'm not going to go through the spiel that I just did, but like I said, I knew I was losing organization. I knew I was gaining this, and that is why I chose that. Rather than I think a lot of junior developers just put this here, and if somebody asks them why'd you put that here and not there, they're like, I don't know. If you have a logical answer and you can reason about why, and you've explored the other options, right? That's the key. So say you did turn this into an interviewer, and the interviewer was on the other side of the fence where they were like, oh man, you should have put this in the network call. Your answer can be intelligent by saying, yeah, I know what you're saying. That was actually my first instinct as well. I actually even refactored it and did it. I ended up not liking it. I felt this was better for the code base, and here's why. If you can have those conversations, like you're golden. Like I said, the actual decision, I don't want to say it's irrelevant, but it's the important thing is to be able to articulate your reasons behind it and have those discussions about the trade-offs, because again, that's where the art of programming is. That's where the interesting discussions are. So that's kind of my rant on that, because I know if I didn't talk about that, so many questions in the comments would have been like, why'd you put this here, not in the network manager? It was a tough decision, but that's why we're here. And now, as you saw, we have our cache up and running. Everything works. We're downloaded. So we're good to go. But if we run it one last time, what we're missing here and what we're going to do in the next video, again, get our people back up there, is, so we're cached, downloaded the images. When we scroll to the bottom though, we want to bring in the next 100. We're not bringing any new people in. We're only seeing the first 100 followers. So we're going to handle that in the next video.